But when all these things were done, and the heir of Isildur had taken up the lordship of men, and the dominion of the West had passed to him, then it was made plain that the power of the Three Rings also was ended, and to the firstborn the world grew old and grey. In that time the last of the Noldor set sail from the havens and left Middle-earth forever. Michael Vanen and well met, my friends. Yoisten here, and I hope you all are doing well, wherever you are in Middle-earth. Today we will be speaking about one of the most important questions regarding the Eldar, the Adaliye, Tolkien's golden children, and our older siblings. We will discuss why the Elves left Middle-earth, and why others like Frodo and Gandalf joined them. To do this, we will look back at the history of Arda and the philosophy Tolkien uses regarding his world at large, and a few other things that I've noticed. Of course, more information, articles, discussions, and videos may be found in the description and cards, so please check those out. Melonin Hanonle for joining me today. Let's begin our tale. Before we look at the end of the Third Age when the Elves left Middle-earth, let's start way back with the beginning of Arda and the living universe Ea in the beginning, during the Ainu Lindale, the music of the Ainur. After the music was made, Iru Iluvatar showed the children of his thought, the Ainur, a vision of the world to be. It was an incomplete history, and some have said the vision ceased before the fulfillments of the rule of men and the end of the time of the Elves. Now this presents a few interesting things, one of which is that since the history was incomplete, there may be some measure of free will in Arda presented through this, but what's more relevant is that the end of the time of the Elves and the dominion of men was foretold in this vision, and that, by the will of Iru, the time of the Elves to leave Middle-earth to their younger siblings and men would come. And so, even from the beginning of time, the plan was set that the Elves would one day have to leave the world of Middle-earth. Continuing on, the Elves awoke under the stars during 1050 of the years of the trees, and at that time there was light emitted from the stars indeed, but more light was in the west, where the Valar, through Orome, welcomed the Elves to live. For the Elves who willingly went into the west, the lands of Aman or Valinor would be their first permanent home, and these Elves would have long memories. Thus, when the Noldor were exiled from Valinor, and many of them followed Feanor to do war with Morgoth, some of them, more than others, knew the price they were paying by leaving. Some, such as Finarfin and his followers, turned back and repented, for that price was too high, and the longing for Valinor, the city of Tirion, and the Valar would be too great a demand for exile. Even many who did leave would, at least in some manner, repent of that choice or long for Valinor deeply in their hearts before long, such as Turgon, who built Vinyamar that looked west towards the sea, and would go on to build Gondolin, which resembled the city of Tirion, and he would send messengers to the Valar asking for aid. Others, such as Feanor and Galadriel, would be proud, perhaps too proud even, to repent for their exile and wish for forgiveness, wanting to have their own lands and their own rule. But even after the War of Wrath ere the end of the First Age, the Valar forgave many of the Elves who left Valinor in exile, or perhaps even some of their descendants, and would welcome them back into the West, but still many Elves stayed in Middle-earth. Then these Elves who stayed were in some ways tied to the conflict with Sauron, for while some Elves would continue to leave during the Second and Third Ages, and the conflicts with Sauron, many others stayed, especially those who received the Three Elven Rings and their followers. While some, such as Círdan, would have perhaps loved nothing more in the depths of their hearts than to finally come to the uttermost west, there would still be much for the Elves to do in Middle-earth. But with the fall of the last High King of the Noldor, Gil-galad, and the gradual diminishment of the Elves, and the end of the power of their Three Elven Rings with the destruction of the One Ring, the time of the Elves continued to falter in Middle-earth. And what's more, a longing for the sea, and a longing for the elven home of old behind it, had awoken within the hearts of the Elves throughout the ages, for Galadriel warned Legolas of such a longing, and indeed he found that longing when he went to Pelargir with Aragorn, Gimli, and the Grey Company, and beheld the sea for himself. That longing to sail over its waves and come to the west would never fade in Legolas until he finally did just that. Many Elves would feel that longing awaken within them, which is something I believe to be a greater power. Perhaps Ulmo and the other Valar had something to do with this, or it was fated by Iru himself or Arda to be a trait of the Elves. Indeed, this desire, almost like a faint hunger that needed to be sated, or thirst that needed to be quenched, became hard for the Elves to ignore, especially as time wore on and the world changed around them, and mortal things they beheld died, and other Elves left the world. In the Return of the King film, Elrond says, "I Iar ken ven namar," meaning, "the sea calls us home." and I think that is practically true. Looking at this more from the view of characters in particular, some would complete their tasks or tests and afterwards desire nothing more than rest in the uttermost west. Círdan would build ships for his people to sail there, and after his task was done, he too would sail. Galadriel would not take the One Ring and would turn to the west, remaining as Galadriel. Thus her ban was removed, and she could return home. Elrond's daughter would be the Queen of the West, and Elrond had nothing left to give. Now this next point is speculation on my part, but I alluded to it a bit earlier. While mortals such as Bilbo, Frodo, Sam, and Gimli who went west would still pass away there, as their dooms were stronger than any power in Valinor, perhaps elves wished to be in a land where all other inhabitants besides these mortals were immortal themselves. Elves had a special fate and were bound to these hither circles of the world, while men at least would go beyond Arda and escape the world. I wonder if the many years of befriending mortals, only to see them perish from mortality, and watching other immortal elves such as Gil-galad die in battle to darkness in Middle-earth throughout the ages, took a toll on the elves who remained. I know the death of Beor was hard on Finrod Felagund, for instance, for elves were not used to seeing time slay people. But at this point in the late Third Age, the elves who remained would have seen this countless times. So perhaps the elves were tired of witnessing mortality, without being mortals themselves, and seeing their own fellow elves die in battle. They wanted to go to the Undying Lands, where immortal folk could live in peace throughout all the ages of the world, and they would not be subjected to witness mortality. In a Reddit post linked in the description, user FantasyWind mentions different points in the history of Middle-earth texts and others that allude to the idea that plants and animals were even longer lasting in Valinor than in Middle-earth, and illness did not plague them. Surely this would be a delight to the elves who lived there, and those that would return there after many ages of the world. For in Middle-earth they would have seen great devastation to nature throughout the many long years and the wars with Sauron. Thus I believe with these many answers, we really answer our question of why did the elves leave Middle-earth. It was their destiny ever since the Ainu Lindale. Ever since the Valar welcomed them there, Valinor would be their permanent home. The elves would feel the pull to the sea and what was beyond, and some completed their tasks and tests, especially with the end of Sauron and the power of the Three Rings. And finally they would be amongst other immortals and long-lasting plants and animals once more in the Undying Lands. As for the Noldor in particular, their original reasons for leaving were long ended, and the time had come for the dominion of men on Earth, as Melkor and his servant Sauron were gone. Now of course some elves would stay, and eventually they would fade or die in Middle-earth, but most elves would leave these hither shores for Valinor. Gandalf even, who also had immortality, but only came to Middle-earth to aid the Free Peoples in the defeat of Sauron, would have to return to Valinor to truly complete his mission. With the fall of Sauron, his purpose in Middle-earth was over, and though he had a few years left before leaving and the end of the age to put things right, he would have to leave indeed. As for Frodo, Arwen would give him her place in Valinor, as also signified with her necklace gift that she gave him in the Return of the King, and Frodo would be given a special place in the West as a ring-bearer, just like Bilbo. For Frodo, Middle-earth would never be what it once was, as his scars ran too deep. But if he was to ever find happiness again, it would be in Valinor, for there, if anywhere, he could truly be healed. Sam was also a ring-bearer, and thus was allotted this honor. As for Gimli, his friendship with the elves seemed to allow him this privilege. Thus, there were many reasons why the elves left Middle-earth, and it was their fate to do so, bequeathing the world to men before they left. And though it is sad that our elder kindred, our older siblings, have disappeared from the world, when Arda is remade and the dominion of men is over, we will see the firstborn again and meet, hand in hand, as long-sundered brothers and sisters. And so we come to the end of our tale. From this story, we see that wisdom comes with accepting what life is and will be. With that acceptance, we can find happiness and peace, just as the elves did in accepting what was to come. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you all enjoyed this episode. If you did, please be sure to hit that like button and share this with a friend. What are your thoughts, questions, additions, and corrections about why the elves left Middle-earth? Let me know in the comments below. This topic reveals just how important the elves were to Tolkien and still are to us, his readers, for the story of Middle-earth in large part begins and ends with the elves. I want to shout out our Valar tier patrons: Adrian De la Torre, Chris Ortner, Peter Sheppard, Jonathan Putnam, Mark Kralik, Blair Scouten, Tobias Goldner, Merchant, John Hume, Tom Bombadil, Reggie93, Jennifer Woods, Sam McBee, Matt Sibbach, Quantum Catalyst, Elizabeth Calvert, Maz Gibbs, Ben Gardner, and Kondar. Thank you so much, and thank you to all of our patrons. Finally, don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell button to join the Men of the West and all of the Free Peoples today. And I'll see you all again next week with a new theory video of your choosing. I put a poll with different theory topics up in our community tab, so please check that out. Everyone, thank you all so much for joining me on this adventure. Until the next one, my great friends.